Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, for those very kind and over-generous remarks. And it's a huge honour and a huge pleasure to be here in Lancaster, my first visit to Lancaster, and presenting this Esmée Fairbairn Lecture. So I want to talk about a great British economist. David Ricardo was not the inventor of economics, I'll come back to that, but he was very important in its development. And his great work, the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published exactly 200 years ago, April actually, but there we are, to the year. There have been, as far as I know, no celebratory events in Britain. I know of conferences commemorating this that took place in Munich, in Zurich, in Brisbane, but nothing in the UK. Well, that's not to say that David Ricardo's ideas are not taken seriously in Britain. In fact, they're quoted on both sides of the Brexit debate, and I'll come back to that. Let me talk a little bit about David Ricardo, the man, because as Andrew said in his introduction, he was actually more interesting than most economists, more interesting than most academics, actually. I guess economists are probably the least interesting of most academics, and Ricardo was an exception. He was born into an immigrant family, Jewish family who'd moved from Portugal via the Netherlands, fell out with his family because he fell in love with a non-Jewish girl, with a Quaker woman, and was estranged from his family. His mother never spoke to him again, apparently, pretty rough. So he was an immigrant who assimilated, who went from an immigrant family, not personally an immigrant, but from first generation who assimilated, which is interesting in itself. He followed his father, though independently, because they were estranged, into stockbroking and became extremely successful. And indeed, as Andrew has mentioned, he made his fortune out of the Battle of Waterloo. I like to think that he was betting, he had an observer who was keeping him up to date. And of course, if you know your history of the Battle of Waterloo, things changed by the hour, and it wasn't at all clear how things were going to go. It was only the last-minute arrival of the Germans who saved who clinched the victory. I think that's a nice analogy for Brexit negotiations. You know, the Germans will come in at the last minute and save us from the French. Maybe not. Anyway, he made so much money, but he made £1 million in 1815. That's a lot of money in one set of transactions around the Battle of Waterloo. That said, he had kind of burnt his boats, couldn't really continue as a stockbroker, so he retired and went to live in his lovely country house, Gatscombe Park, now the residence of Princess Anne in Gloucestershire, and there he lived the life of a country gentleman and held boozy lunch parties. We can't be sure about the booze, but there's one story I have to tell because it's hard to believe it happened without a lot of alcohol being consumed. We don't have diaries in detail, but we do have a letter from a contemporary novelist, actually an Irish novelist, Maria Edgeworth. She was a guest of Ricardo's at one of these lunch parties, and as happens at parties like that, the discussion moved from one topic to another, and they started to talk about Cromwell, but actually about Cromwell's body. And the background is, as you may know, Cromwell died 2 years before the Restoration, was given a formal burial, but after Charles II came to the throne, his body was dug up and officially executed. Dead, 2-year-old dead body executed, and rather unpleasant things done. I won't go into details. And his head was removed from the body. And this was the topic of discussion at the lunch party. See, economists aren't always boring. So Cromwell's head, then, what happened to it? And Ricardo said, well, actually, I know what happened to it. In fact, a neighbour of mine has the head in his possession. So the whole party got into their carriages. No worries about being a designated driver. I presume they must have been all totally drunk at this stage. And they headed off to the neighbouring farm. And there, Ricardo and his wife held up the head. So the neighbour, who's a cousin, I think, or brother-in-law, produced the head. And Ricardo and his wife held it up. And a conversation ensued about, yes, was it really Cromwell's head? The scars seemed to tally with what had happened to it, and so on. You couldn't make this up, could you? I mean, Jane Austen meets Night of the Living Dead. It's kind of extraordinary. However, I don't want to suggest that he was a frivolous dilettante. On the contrary, after his success as stockbroker, he wrote his famous book, and he became later a member of Parliament and was a prominent speaker and a prominent thinker on many applied issues, very much a liberal, on the liberal side of pretty well every debate. in favour of, against slavery, against capital punishment, in favour of parliamentary reform, and as it happens, very strongly in favour of free trade. And that's where I come in, or rather that's where Ricardo the economist comes in, because I want to talk about Ricardo as an economist, and in particular about his views on trade, and draw out some ideas which he had, and perhaps suggest something of their contemporary relevance today. So, I also want to make a sort of grand claim, in a way. I want to claim that Ricardo was perhaps, can be seen as the person who made economics into a science. I know some people don't think economics is a science. It's no big deal about being a science. It's not that there's anything special about it. It's not a very good science. It's not like physics. It's more like medicine, sort of it's an applied science. But there is a core of theory which you need in order to treat your patients or to try and persuade them to give up smoking or whatever. So I think Ricardo has to be given credit for being in at the start of that. The founder of economic theory in the sense of what? Well, taking an approach which involves deliberately simplified assumptions, okay, plus abstract reasoning, leading to general principles. And those general principles then applied to a range of issues and left for others to apply further. I think that's an important background. You could argue the second essential ingredient for being a science. There is a separate and first ingredient, which I think it could be said was supplied by Adam Smith. His great book came out in 1776, the founder of economics, and he was very different from Ricardo, had a much broader perspective. He had a concern with empirics. If you look at, I think it used to be, it's no longer the £10 note, Adam Smith on the cover and on the back, his stylized vision of a pin factory. He actually visited a pin factory and talked about the division of labour in pin factories. Ricardo didn't visit pin factories. He was a theorist. But you need both. You need both kinds of economists. You need both kinds of people to develop a science. And I think we have to give credit to both for that. But Ricardo had many important ideas. We can trace his lineage in many fields in economics, but where remarkably he has had most influence is in the theory of international trade. If you start a course in international trade, the first lecture typically is on the Ricardian model. And I'm going to argue that he provided canonical answers to two of the three main questions in the field. What those answers are, and what the third question that he didn't address is, will be the theme of my talk. So let's start with the big idea, Ricardo's big idea, which is comparative advantage. And to understand it, I think you have to think about how people thought about trade before Ricardo. Now, there are really two phases to this. There's what you might call trade theory 0.0. That's at the very beginning and also 0 out of 10. It's really a very poor theory. Goes by the name of mercantilism. It's a bit unfair in a way because many of the people who wrote in this sort of 17th century, early 18th, mid-18th century writers, many of them were smart, many of them were intelligent people, but they weren't thinking systematically, and insofar as they were thinking systematically, they were getting it quite wrong. They believed in protection, they believed that exports are good things, trade surpluses are good things, giving stuff away to foreigners. Anyway, imports are bad, consuming stuff from abroad is bad. Well, anyway, I'm not going to talk too long about this. In fact, I'm hardly going to mention it at all. You could call it a zombie theory. Lots of other people have shown just how stupid it is, how wrong it is. It's implicit in everything I'll say later, how wrong it is. But it refuses to die, it won't go away. And we have one prominent exponent of it at the moment in the White House. You heard the inaugural speech, American Carnage. I forget if the quote, protection will lead to great prosperity, was in that speech or perhaps around that time. The science says no. The history says no. It's just not true. Protection, there are no known cases of protection leading to great prosperity. There are many examples of the end of protection improving matters. It's complicated, but as a generalization, that is just silly. Still, it's catchy, isn't it? And people who believe this, have great catchy phrases. Donald Trump's director of the White House National Trade Council, Peter Navarro, has a fantastic title, Death by China. I mean, isn't that a cool title? The idea that by importing from China, the US is dying. Well, individual people lost their jobs, yes, but on average, and so on. We'll come back to that. The idea of death by China as a concept is really, really very silly. Well, that's a long time before Ricardo. But then we come along to Adam Smith, whom I've said already, arguably the founder of economics, a great economist. I mean, an essential person in the history of the subject. And very important, reads very well, worth reading today, much easier to read than Ricardo. And his theory of trade was that trade patterns, who exports what, to whom, is based on absolute advantage. So the idea of absolute advantage, well, it's a big advance over mercantilism. Okay? It begins to actually explain things. It makes predictions, which turn out to be true in many cases. Absolute advantage, whether countries have high or low productivity, the higher the better. It is indeed a central determinant of absolute living standards. And it's also an important a key determinant of the volume of trade. But if you're interested in the pattern of trade, what countries actually export or what they don't, it turns out it's clear, it's simple, and it's wrong. Okay? Or rather, it's not always wrong, but you can't rely upon it to be right. It's wrong in two whole different dimensions. Let me talk you through just as an example. The idea of absolute advantage, it's very commonsensical, okay? But it's the curse of common sense. We need serious theory, serious science to cure us of some kinds of common sense, because common sense is often misinformed. So let's think of an example. Europe's more efficient at producing cars than China, right? Hard to argue. So Europe should export cars to China. Seems okay so far. What's the problem? Now, efficiency here, of course, is something real. It's about workers, how well trained workers are, how productive they are. So it's measured in real terms. Of course, workers also work with machines. Indeed, in Europe, they tend to work with very sophisticated machines, with capital, with robots, with sophisticated electronically controlled monitors and so on. And also with factories that have all sorts of elaborate software and indeed hardware to improve the efficiency of the workers. Indeed, given all that, it's hard to argue against the suggestion that Europe, if it wanted to, would be more efficient at producing textiles than China. Okay? I mean, it'll all be done by robots, of course, but mostly. But if European firms really wanted to get into doing that, wouldn't they also be good at doing it as well as cars? But then, right, so Europe should export textiles to China then as well. Something isn't quite right here, is it? Of course, it's wages. So Chinese wages are much lower, and that's why Chinese workers, although they're not physically more efficient, in some economic sense, they're able to produce textiles more cheaply. So that explains why China will actually, and indeed does, export textiles to the rest of the world, and why the European textile industry is more or less closed down. So that's good. So efficiency is actually in money terms. Got it? We thought it was in real terms, but no, it's in money terms. The only thing is, if it's in money terms, why don't they, at those wages, couldn't they produce cars very cheaply? So we're in a circular loop. It's the curse of common sense. There's no real way out of this. It's just wrong. The starting point of taking absolute advantage, what you're absolutely good at, is very misleading. It's misleading in the sense of what it leads you to expect. But it's also misleading in terms of how it makes you think about who's right and who's wrong in this. It tends to indulge common sense prejudices. Because you look at this scenario and you say one of two things. You say, well, Europe is exploiting poor countries because it's more efficient. And that's unfair. That's poor, bad competition. Alternatively, you look at it through, let's say, Trumpian glasses, and you say China's competing unfairly, its wages or its currency are too low, and that's just wrong. And something should be done about it. Well, this is absolute advantage. There's a core there that's perfectly okay. The notion of focusing on productivity, especially as a determinant of living standards, is central in economics. But as a determinant of trade patterns, it's not good. We need Ricardo, and Ricardo came along with his big idea, comparative advantage. It's very counterintuitive. Paul Samuelson, one of the great 20th century economists, has a great quote. I left in the sexist bit there. He said, "Thousands of important and intelligent people have never been able to grasp the doctrine for themselves or to believe it after it was explained to them." This was Samuelson's reflections on a dinner party he'd been at, where some prominent mathematician had said to him, "Tell me one thing in economics that is correct and not obvious." And Samuelson hadn't been able to think of anything, which was unusual for him. This Stanislav Ulam, I don't know if mathematicians, he must have been quite a strong personality, because Samuelson was quite a strong personality. And then Samuelson realized afterwards he should have said comparative advantage because of this point. It's right, it's correct, but it's also very counterintuitive. Well, maybe not. The point about comparative advantage is it stresses not differences, but differences in differences. This is something we've only come to understand recently. There's a paper by Arno Costino just a few years ago in Econometrica, which brought this out rather clearly and maybe made us rethink a bit this whole idea of comparative advantage. Differences in differences. So go back to my example of China and Europe. Well, what matters is that Europe's better at doing everything. It could produce all the textiles in the world really efficiently, but it's relatively better at producing autos, producing cars. Okay? So it's relatively more efficient at producing cars than textiles. It's quite a subtle comparison we're making there. It's the difference between Europe and China in their ability to produce textiles and cars. But the beauty about doing it that way is that difference in differences makes the prediction that Europe will export cars, China will export textiles, and it gets rid of the stuff that actually doesn't matter for trade patterns directly. It gets rid of the exchange rates and the wages. You're taking differences in differences, so those nominal variables actually get netted out. It's not that they're not important. They are important for other things, of course, but they're not important for the composition of trade. That was the extraordinarily rich insight that Ricardo had, and the extraordinarily rich insight that is now essential reading in, as I say, pretty much the very first lecture that most people take in international trade. Okay? And also going back to what we said about the dangers of thinking through an absolute advantage lens, you end up inevitably blaming somebody. Well, actually, this predicts that everyone gains from trade, and trade is not a zero-sum game. In fact, it suggests that smaller countries will gain more, maybe big, very large countries won't gain very much. Quite a bit of evidence for that, actually. But it says that on aggregate, no country will lose. And that, I think, is an important insight. Open to debate, and there are exceptions and qualifications which one would have to make in a full course on international trade. But let me stick to the big ticket items and say that that's the key contribution that Ricardo made. It set an agenda for theory and empirics, and it actually took quite a long time. I mean, in a sense, it's broadly consistent with what we observe in the world, especially between countries that differ a lot. We do observe patterns of trade which seem to reflect comparative advantage, deriving perhaps from superior technology, or as other theories had it, deriving from differences in factor endowments, countries that had more labour relative to capital, more skilled labour relative to unskilled labour, we might say today, tending to export different kinds of goods. And proper scientific confirmation took a bit longer. The theory was originally presented by Ricardo, perhaps remembering his Portuguese roots, or perhaps drawing on the fact that there was, believe it or not, there was a trade agreement between Britain and Portugal in the 1770s. I've forgotten, I should have checked this. It's sometimes called the Port Treaty. It's one of the reasons why why Britain is still a big market for Portuguese wine. Perhaps reflecting that, Ricardo had this lovely textbook example of England and Portugal, England exporting with a comparative advantage in cloth, textiles, as it had at the time, Portugal with a comparative advantage in wine. Well, that's a beautiful example, but low dimensionality, two countries, two goods, hard to bring that to data. Duncan McDougall, in a famous paper, did so, but it took some time. The theory had to be generalized. I won't go into the details. It had to be extended mathematically, and that did allow, very recently, confirmation and quantification of the predictions of the theory. And in a broad way, it does indeed work remarkably well. What about the legacy for policy? Well, that's also very important. Taken literally, it might suggest universal free trade. Free trade is always good. Well, I did qualify what I said earlier. I said countries as a whole will gain. And I think that's important. And I actually think that is what the evidence suggests, that overall countries will gain. But that isn't necessarily enough to justify a 100% move to free trade, as indeed some people arguing about the policy direction Britain should take post-Brexit have been saying. We need to have universal free trade, abandon all tariffs. Well, that might be not such a good idea for reasons that Ricardo also addressed. I said he produced solutions to two of the big, he posed the questions actually, and produced solutions to two of the big questions in international economics. And the second one that he posed and answered reasonably satisfactorily is the interaction between trade and income distribution. Here he was debating the big issue of the day in the 1810s and 1820s, the corn laws, high tariffs on imported corn. And he pointed out that eliminating corn tariffs, well, actually, I shouldn't say he pointed out, it was clear that this would harm landowners and help workers, help labourers, as they were called. He suggested, and it's sort of implicit in what he did and has been brought out by subsequent writers, that there would be net gains, implying that the losers could be compensated. In practice, they never are. Landowners didn't really get compensation for the abolition of these tariffs, which were allowing them to sell high-priced cereals to urban workers. But the urban workers benefited, and of course their employers benefited by having a well-fed population, and arguably that was one contributing factor to industrial development in Britain after the repeal, which took place a little while after Ricardo's death, but he was an actual participant. He was an active participant in the debates. I think it's fair to say that Ricardo should only be given credit for trade and income distribution 1.0. Not that what he said was wrong, but that it was quite primitive. It wasn't spelt out formally in the way that he did spell out the theory of comparative advantage very formally. He got the basic idea right. Okay? And if you like, what he said is quite commonsensical. Okay? But we've talked about the dangers of common sense already, and it's true that on this topic too, one has to be a little bit more careful. In modern parlance, you'd say, and Ron Findlay, I mentioned, references are in my slides, and if anyone is interested, it's been pointed out that what he said can be viewed as an early version of a particularly simple, starkly but very usefully simple model of trade, the specific factors model. Each sector has its own specific stuff. Agriculture has land, which is specific, can only be used in agriculture. Industry, manufacturing has capital, or something like that, which can only be used in industry, and so on. They don't move backwards and forwards. It's only labour that moves. Well, it took a lot of work to integrate all that with the theory of comparative advantage. When that was done, we get a more sophisticated, much more sophisticated version of the same idea, which I mentioned Samuelson already, sometimes so known as the Stolper-Samuelson effect, the basic idea that if a skill-abundant country liberalizes, opens itself up to trade, then that will benefit the skilled workers but harm the unskilled workers. Well, that sort of idea has been much debated in the last few decades, and there is evidence for it. It's complicated because, again, there aren't just two factors. There is one very robust sort of central nugget of truth in that, first pointed out by Belize here, that from trade, you can always expect there to be one winner and one loser. Maybe many people in the middle who gain a bit, lose a bit, but there will be one group who will win outright, and in the sense that their wages, their returns will go up relative to everything they could consume. One loser who will lose everything. And there's evidence of that, and more recent studies have been done for the US. This paper by, sorry, I went too fast there. Sorry, and now I've lost my, no I haven't. Okay. So this paper by Autor, Dorn and Hansen caused quite a stir when it came out, because it looked at the negative effects of China, the China syndrome it's called, and it's a good paper, appeared in the American Economic Review, yes, bunch of papers, one in the American top journal, and argued that in fact Chinese import penetration was responsible for a lot of the problems with American income distribution that had come about. The countervailing argument that at the same time the benefits of China opening up to trade to the US were an ability to export more and also cheaper goods available to consumers, and that's been pointed out. So again, the idea that on average everybody gains, but if you're not, but nobody is Mr. or Ms. Average, and if you're the one who loses, well, you're going to be sore, and you're going to want redress, and you're going to find it appealing to listen to populists who claim they can turn the clock back and restore the old industries which have, let's face it, probably vanished without trace. Now, I don't want to pretend that Ricardo knew it all. That's what science is about. We stand on the shoulders of giants, but we build on it, on what we know from them. And we have learned a lot since then. I want to talk about a few issues. I want in particular to talk about gravity, because I've already said that there are three big questions in trade. Who exports what? Okay. Who gains and who loses within a country? And the third question is, what's the volume of trade? How big is trade as a whole? Is it going to be big or small? Will you trade more with some countries rather than others? And so on. And gravity turns out to be, only relatively recently, we've understood just how important that is. I'll talk about a few other of these examples. That said, there are people out there who don't believe in gravity. So let's call them anti-gravity. Let's, for the sake of argument, just put faces on the names. This is, I like to call him Mr. Gravity. This person you probably don't know, Maurizio, wherever he is, the chair of the economics department here in Lancaster, was a student of Jim Anderson's, an old friend of mine, and an economist who wrote in 1969 a paper setting out the theoretical basis for the so-called gravity model. You know about gravity, thanks to Newton, the idea that two masses will attract each other depending on their distance. Empirical findings had suggested the same was true for trade, but it took a long time to understand that. At first it seemed to be atheoretical, and then after a while, thanks to the work of Jim and many others, it turned out that we now understand it a lot better. Mr. Anti-Gravity, well, you know who that is. That's Liam Fox, the UK Minister for International Trade. He's in good company, as I'll come to in a minute. This is the gravity equation. They say this, I was asked to be non-technical, they say one equation in a non-technical work loses half your audience, so please feel free to leave now. But that's, I'm not going to talk you through it. It is the gravity equation. It's a thing of beauty, and it is really interesting and exciting and has lots of implications, which I would love to talk about in detail. But this is not a graduate trade class, rather a general audience. Let me give you, I guess, the bottom line is the volume of trade is negatively related to distance, the cost of trading from one country to another. That's the bottom line. Not everyone agrees. Here's this quote from Liam Fox. Today we stand on the verge of an unprecedented ability to liberate global trade for the benefit of our whole planet. Technological advances dissolving away the barriers of time and distance. It's a wonderfully beautiful prose and beautiful concept, potentially the beginning of what I might call post-geography trading world. Okay. Now, Mr. Fox is in good company here. Anti-gravity is not stupid. Here are two books which I recommend. They're well worth reading. Thomas Friedman, prominent journalist, New York Times journalist. The World is Flat. Great titles these people have. And Francis Cairncross, formerly editor of The Economist, later a colleague of mine in Oxford, The Death of Distance. These books are full of interesting anecdotes, full of interesting ideas. And what they're saying, of course, is the same as Liam Fox. We're entering the post-gravity world. Well, it's not stupid, but it is wrong. Sorry. The evidence is against it. This is just not the way the world works. There is overwhelming evidence that the world has not become flat, rather that trade declines with distance. I can give you numbers. There's a recent survey article. Keith Head Thierry Mayer gave the average estimate using the preferred method of the distance elasticity, minus 1.1. Well, think of it as minus 1. Okay? So that's saying that countries, other things equal, that are twice as far away, you will trade with them half as much. That's a big effect of distance. Okay? This is taken from 159 papers. For those of you who worry about the science, standard deviation 0.41, the median's about the same. I gave a much earlier version of this talk to a European trade conference recently, and at this stage I stopped and I said, hands up now, everyone who's estimated a gravity equation. I'm a theorist, but I put my hand up. 200 out of 300 in the audience, Maurizio was there, put their hands up, and then I said, now keep your hand up if you got a 0 distance coefficient, and the hands went down. Or 0.1, no hands. 0.2, 0.3, I went to 0.5 and I said, I'll stop there, don't need to go any further, because a distance elasticity of minus 0.5 really means the trade falls off a lot. A distance coefficient of 1.1, minus 1.1, means it falls off an awful lot. Distance is not dead. Okay? There's actually a puzzle here, because you would have thought that this effect may be strong, but shouldn't it be declining? Globalization, technology, the internet, and so on. Well, there's no evidence for that either, which perhaps is a puzzle. I think talk to Jim Anderson about this. One conjecture is that this is because distance, the costs of distance have been affected for every distance. I mean, it's true that now it's easier to, if you want to, sell your things to Australia. But it's also easier to arrange to go for coffee with someone in the next office, or certainly in the next office building, by just sending them an email or sending them a text. The cost of distance at close-up has fallen. The cost of communicating over short distances have fallen just as much, perhaps proportionately, as the costs of communicating over large. That's a conjecture. The evidence is that there is this paradox of globalization, or missing globalization. The distance isn't going away. The evidence shows that the world is not becoming flat. Remarkably, it matters not just for trade, but for all kinds of foreign direct investment. I'm giving the references because these are not obvious. And in decreasing order, the numbers, the elasticities aren't as strong. Equities, people are more likely to hold domestic equities, but they're more likely to hold equities from a nearby country than from a distant one. eBay contacts, Google hits. If you don't believe that, think yourself of your recent usage of Google. Of course, it's nice to look up something about New Zealand volcanoes or whatever, but how many times do you use Google to check out a local restaurant? Or how many times do you use the web to, or use your mobile phone to make an arrangement to see somebody who's very close to you for dinner that night or for a drink, whatever? Most of our usage, there is still a falling off dramatically with Google hits, with distance of Google hits, but even much more strongly with trade. Okay? So trade really is affected by gravity, and it would be nice if it wasn't, perhaps, but I'm afraid it is. That's not all we've learnt, of course, since Ricardo. One other thing which is, well, let me talk briefly about a few other topics that have been the subject of research in trade in recent years, and their relevance, which are particularly relevant for current debates. The idea of comparative advantage, we've seen, is a focus on trade between industries. So one country exports cars, and the other country exports textiles. And with many industries, you expect to get the same. And that's a very good model for trade between countries that differ quite a lot. But it may be not so good for countries that are quite similar. You look at Europe, you look at Britain, you look at Britain, France, and Germany, and you'll see all of those three countries export cars to each other. Okay? Is there a comparative advantage in cars between those three countries? And the answer is probably not. What's going on is that these countries have got large firms that specialize in particular brands of cars, and their products are differentiated. Mercedes is different from a Peugeot, from a Vauxhall, and so on. So that kind of trade is very different, and that generate a lot of interest. Won the Nobel Prize for Paul Krugman, who was one of the first proponents of the idea. It's been shown that intra-industry trade is particularly important between similar economies. So again, countries that are very different, trade typically driven by comparative advantage. Countries that are much less different, trade will be driven by this increasing returns, product differentiation idea. And that implies that opening up to trade has a further source of gain. It implies increased variety. Sometimes you go into a supermarket tired at the end of the day and you see 100 different ready meals or ingredients or whatever, and you would prefer not quite so much diversity. But on average, let's face it, it's better to have a wider choice rather than not. And that is a source of gains from trade, which very much is brought about by intra-industry trade. But what I want to stress in particular is a point that was emphasized in one of Krugman's earlier papers, not one of his most cited papers, which is that intra-industry trade leads to lower costs of adjustment than inter-industry trade. He wasn't the first to point this out. This had been noted by a number of scholars at a practical level. They had gone out and seen, in particular, in the early days of the European community, European Economic Community as it was, now the European Union, they noted that the reductions in tariffs had led not to much disruption because it wasn't a case of France and Germany, say, specializing in different industries. Rather, it was that the big firms, the big plants in each of these countries got bigger. And that's easier to accommodate. Remember, the problem with comparative advantage is you get efficiency by specializing, but you're basically closing down one industry, closing down the industry you're no good at. With intra-industry trade, that's not the case. What you're doing is you're expanding the successful firms within an industry, and the successful firms within the same industry in the other country are similarly expanding. You don't get the same kind of Rust Belt phenomenon of a whole industry closing down in one country. And Krugman showed that the new theories made sense of that phenomenon, and it's, I think, a key idea in understanding modern developments and thinking why certain kinds of trade liberalization have posed rather little disruption, you might say, have for political, in terms of generating animosity, generating political tension, they have been much less problematic than the kinds of trade we've seen with very different countries, trade with China, trade with countries that have superior superior ability to compete in some industries because of comparative advantage. So I think that's a very, very important insight. A different insight, which again was to some extent was prefigured by Adam Smith. This is a quote from Adam Smith. I mentioned his pin factory idea. Look on the back of your, I think it was a £10 note. The division of labour limited by the extent of the market. So the idea that as markets get bigger, workers can be put to specialize in more individual tasks, and that's more efficient. Well, it turns out it's not just workers who can do that, but firms can specialize. The bigger the market, the more specialized the intermediate suppliers can be. And so what we observe in today's world is the development reflecting this increasing divisionalization of work, the increasing trade in, not just in goods, but what you might call trade in tasks, what has been called trade in tasks by Grossman and Rossi Hansberg. We see value chains that spread not just across a country, but even globally, and certainly at a regional level, mega-regional, in the sense of European or East Asian or whatever. We have, if you think of the Airbus airplane, which is assembled in Toulouse, but the wings are made in North Wales and flown in specially developed gigantic planes whose noses open up. The nose of a plane opening up to get the wing of an Airbus into it, that has to be big. It is big, and they fly over, duty-free, but also regulation-free, and stuff lands in Toulouse and is assembled. Well, understanding that process is something we're still thinking through, understanding its implications. It's a different kind of trade. It may not be so different. It may not have very different implications, but it certainly is something to think about. A lot of current research focusing on the implications of this. And it's something which just didn't, as a real-world phenomenon, didn't exist much in Ricardo's day. And obviously, we've had to rethink our views of trade as real-world trade itself has evolved. One other development, an important development, is thinking about firms as entities rather than as sort of passive players who are just doing stuff there, but firms who are really important players themselves and differing a lot. The idea, which pioneered by Mark Mellitz in recent work, that firms are different. Some are very small. In fact, most firms are very small. Most firms don't export. They're too small to export. The exporters tend to be the superstars, really big ones who get out there and do the stuff. And that leads also to the suggestion that very large firms are doing a lot internally. They're intra-firm, there's a lot going on. They're multi-product. They're producing a lot of different goods. They're exporting to lots of different countries. All of this has implications for how we think about trade in the modern world. My own work, I'll just mention that one implication, that globalization in these models typically implies what's sometimes called the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect, to those who have more shall be given. What we seem to observe, and the empirical evidence isn't clear on this, but we do seem to observe the phenomenon that globalization has led to more competition, definitely, but it hasn't led to what you might call the level playing field of big firms that were big 50 or 100 years ago being losing market share dramatically. If you think of many industries, certainly established industries, the leading players are in fact the same leading players that were there 50 or 100 years ago. It's just now they're multinational on a much greater scale than they were, whether it's the auto industry, the toothpaste industry, the major manufacturers of toothpaste, all of them 100 years old, all of them dominant, even more dominant today than they were 100 years ago. And also the suggestion of further direction of research, the strategic behavior. Superstar firms are different. They're different not just because they do more, but because they think through the questions more, because they're planning and playing games against each other in a sophisticated way. The last topic I'll mention of new developments is really not a separate field. I'll call it big data and quantification. It's really more, think about it as the techniques that are used to implement the other 1, 2, 3, 4 developments, and indeed the theory of comparative advantage itself. We now have, I mentioned gravity already. Well, gravity put forward in 1969 as a theory, there wasn't much data available, and the data that was there was hard to process. Now, the average graduate student with their laptop can carry out extraordinarily sophisticated analyses that were not possible some years ago. And it's that quantification which has been made possible by the data becoming available and by the processing power to understand and deal with the data becoming available. That's what's given rise to an explosion of work on the scientific study of international trade, just as it has, of course, of other branches of economics as well. So much for the theory. So how does this bear relevance to current policy debates? Well, I'm going to have a little fun for a bit and talk about this just introduce the issues in the context of the second part of my title, Ricardo, to Brexit. And Brexit is a controversial topic, but let's not avoid controversy. Rather, let's start with a puzzle. Here's a question. So what are these people doing? By the way, apparently this talk is going to be on the web, but without the photos for copyright reasons. So forgive me if I speak in a little detail about what you see in the photos. So what are these people doing? This is a well-known photo of President Trump and Prime Minister May 5 days after his election. And a special relationship between the two. They certainly looked to be getting on very well. This is another photograph around the same time. This is Liam Fox again with Rodrigo Duterte, who's president of the Philippines. And they're shaking hands, and in his speech on that occasion, Liam Fox talked about the shared values between Britain and the Philippines, and that hopefully was an attempt to project those values, but it's easy to distort that and say that there was perhaps it wasn't the best turn of phrase on the occasion. But remember the question, what are they doing? What are these people doing? Any clues? Well, hands, maybe the holding hands, shaking hands, tiny hands, hands that by their own admission have done unspeakable things to women, hands that by their own admission have thrown unconvicted criminals out of helicopters, and that's the clue. Because in the future, these are going to be British helicopters. That at least is the hope. What are these people doing? They're discussing trade agreements, right? I've spent most of my career discussing trade agreements. And for most of the time, people's eyes, if they weren't economists, glazed over. And they said, how boring. But in the past year, trade agreements have been the thing that most people in Britain talk about and most politicians think about most of the time. I'm being a little playful here, and let me justify my playfulness and perhaps clarify my position on the issue. I'm talking about Brexit, and I want to focus on the science. But I'm going to take a slide, before I get to the science, about the politics, the ideology, and maybe the outrage on all sides. And obviously I can't hope to be unprejudiced, I'll come to that, and I can't hope to be comprehensive. I suppose I want to say I'm going to be focusing on trade agreements, and I want to make the point that trade agreements are fundamentally political. Okay? You might even say fundamentally non-economic. They do, of course, deal with economic issues in a very important way. They have a big influence on the nature of trade and so on. Gravity models do show that, by the way, something I didn't mention when I was discussing them earlier. But at the same time, the motivation is political, and you see that in the old, the treaty between Britain and Portugal in whatever it was, the 1770s, driven at the time by friendly relations between the two countries. Similarly, a treaty, sometimes called the Cobden Treaty, Cobden-Bright Treaty, between Britain and France in the 1850s. At the time with Napoleon III in power, Britain and France had reached a rapprochement and made a trade agreement, and led to quite a bit of increase in trade, which ended with the end of that Napoleonic regime in 1870. So the political context is something you can't avoid. For my economist colleagues, I want to mention, for people who know the literature on trade, I have a digression here where I want to say that in our trade models, we do talk about political economy, and we deal with, I think, very important issues, but they're not quite the issues I'm discussing here. I'll just mention in brief, there are ways in which economists, like me, have tried to understand trade agreements in terms of trade, externality, commitment, device to restrict producer interest. I'm presenting a paper on that topic in the economics department here in Lancaster tomorrow. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking here about political in a much rawer, much simpler, much coarser way, you might say. Putting it differently, you might say that, like any international treaty, trade agreements imply some loss of sovereignty. They're giving up sovereignty in one realm in return for gains in another. Okay? And having the determination and the will to carry that through and to follow it up is something which doesn't come easily and typically involves quite a bit of political capital and so on. I want to say, rather bluntly, that as economists, we don't really have the right to condemn non-economic views. And in particular, I want to make clear that I don't think there is an a very strong, I'll come back to the details, but there isn't a very strong economic case against Brexit. Okay? Because Brexit isn't about economics. It's about a lot of things. It's about identity, it's about history, it's about belonging, and so on. I think we have to be very careful to be clear on what we are saying and what we're entitled to say. I think we also have to recognize that many people who surveys show, many people who voted for Brexit are perfectly willing to pay. They accept that there may be an economic cost and they're willing to pay that cost. Maybe not all. Maybe they underestimate the cost. I'll come to that. But I think it is clear that people who voted for Brexit are not by any means unclear on what they're doing. Of course, life is complicated. We are not, even economists have souls, believe it or not. We too have feelings on issues, and as citizens, we've every right to express those feelings. Okay? But we have to be careful. We shouldn't claim too much. Okay? I'm thinking here of Project Fear, which was criticized in the run-up to the referendum as being, the Remain side, exaggerating that everything would get worse, from the weather to international cooperation and so on. Well, I think we have to be clear that that's, the evidence suggests, I'll come to the evidence in a minute and the arguments, that Brexit will have an economic hit, but it won't be a disaster. You might say it'll be less Dunkirk, more winter of discontent. The harder the Brexit, the bigger the economic costs. That's what the evidence suggests. That's what the science suggests. But it's not going to be. It's not going to push Britain back into the Stone Age. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's something which will be easy to sweep under the carpet if you're a convinced Brexiter, and easy, perhaps for everyone, to cope with over time. Although there will be disruption costs in the short run. So as citizens, we shouldn't claim too much. we should also not abuse our position, as indeed I have, in a way, abused my position, at least in the previous slide. The honour that was done to me by inviting me here to the University of Lancaster was not because I've got strong views on Brexit, which I have, but because I'm an economist, and you want to hear the economic side. And I think that it's important for me to stick to the economics of it, while at the same time not pretending where I come from or where I don't. So I think we should declare our interests. My interests are clear. I think it's obvious that I'm speaking as a citizen now, and I might even say speaking as a citizen of Ireland, Europe, and the world. And that's where I'm coming from. But I'm now going to go back to the science, because that's really what you are, as it were, invited to hear me speak about. And I'm going to try and stick to the science and ask a rather specific question. What is the best trade agreement for the UK at the moment, in the current circumstances? What do we know, what can we learn from Ricardo and the research that has been done since about this important issue on which we all have views and so on? Well, there are two extreme views, you might say. Extreme is a bit strong. Let me not perhaps put it quite like that. But one view can be described as global Britain. And let me give you a very nice quote on this. I think it's a typical sentiment. It's widely held. I don't think it makes sense for us to pretend we should remain in the single market. I think there are real question marks about whether it makes sense to remain in the customs union. Doing so could undermine the government's ability to sign trade deals with other countries outside the bloc. This is a quote from a very distinguished economist. This is a mainstream view held by many people. This is a quote from Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, last December. It's a view widely shared and expressed by many politicians, and so the idea that withdrawing from European institutions is going to be maybe no harm in itself and will open Britain up, allow it to become a great trading nation with countries that are not in the EU. That's one view. As trade agreements go, I would argue an alternative, the other extreme you might say, is the single market itself. Some non-economists, when I say this to them, they're puzzled. They say, single market? Well, the first thing to get right is the single market is a trade agreement. It's not that it's anything else. You might say it's more than a trade agreement. No, it's an agreement on trade in goods, in services, in factors of production, which is economists speak for workers. It's about international migration, free international migration within the union and so on. But it's basically about trade in all those entities. And we have what I'm going to describe, I'm going to use the term global Britain in this specific sense of arguing that Britain should leave the trade agreement that is the single market and seek trade agreements with other countries elsewhere. I'm not talking about the diplomatic or the political barriers or the timing of actually making those agreements with other countries. I'm just going to say, suppose Britain could seamlessly move to trade agreements with other countries. What could we expect? Would we expect to be better off or worse off or whatever? Who to trade with? What does the theory of international trade, 200 years old, a British invention, you could argue, what does it tell us about the choices that have to be made? I'm going to give you, not numbers, I'm going to give you some general ideas based on what I've said already. If you want numbers, I recommend strongly recent papers by Tom Sampson and by him and Swati Dhingra and a bunch of colleagues at LSE who have put numbers on what I'm going to say. And what I'm saying is going to be totally in line with theirs, but I'm not concerned too much about the numbers. I'm a theorist, like Ricardo, and they would be the first to admit we can't be sure of the numbers. There's a huge margin of error attached to each of them. But let's talk through the issues. What are the lessons from Ricardo, first of all? Well, we've already seen the lessons reasonably clearly. The issue is how different are countries. If you trade with a country that's very different from you, there's potential for large gains. Okay? And the danger, of course, is there's potential for disruption. The most disruption is likely to come from trading with countries that differ from you, that have skills, expertise, comparative advantage in industries, in sectors in which we do not have the same potential. So that's one starting point, and you can see perhaps then why the process of European Union in the 1950s and 60s was relatively easy because countries involved were fairly similar to each other. The countries which, the process of trade liberalization in the 90s and 2000s, the setting up the World Trade Organization, the Uruguay round, the most recent round of trade negotiations, has brought quite a bit of disruption because it's allowed countries like China and Bangladesh, Vietnam and others to come into the world market to improve the lot of their own people enormously. Living standards in these countries have improved dramatically. World inequality has fallen dramatically thanks to trade liberalization. But there have been losers. And the losers have been people working in textiles and autos and so on in rich countries. Okay? So that's one lesson. And I suppose what you might conclude from that, think again about the question, what's the ideal trade agreement for the UK? With whom should the UK trade? Well, you want to respect comparative advantage, but maybe not too much. If you're going to have free trade, well, do you really want free trade with countries far away with very different economic structures, extremely, in comparative terms, extremely efficient at producing some things which will wipe out our industries, okay? In the same sectors? Maybe not. Maybe not immediately, at least. It might make sense to have some kind of transition period to avoid the disruption. Okay? Of course, the recent work on gravity that I mentioned suggests that you would like your trade agreement to be with countries that are nearby. You would like the agreement to work with gravity rather than against it. Okay? You would prefer that it doesn't have the effect of diverting trade away from countries that are what you might call natural trade partners, local, natural because they're local, to trading with countries that are far away. Doing that will impose costs, and it's not going to be ideal, and it's actually going to take some time to replace any trade that is closed off with nearby countries, to replace it with countries that are further away. What else can we say? Well, in the modern world, it would be nice to have a trade agreement. The deeper, the better in a way, because trade in the modern world, I mentioned supply chains, for example. Supply chains would be very disrupted by tariffs, but actually tariffs are not really so important in modern trade, certainly where supply chains are concerned. Within Europe, I mentioned the Airbus wings being flown from North Wales to Toulouse. The effect of tariffs on that would be catastrophic. But even without tariffs, imagine if every one of those wings has to be noted and annotated, and a little form filled in, and a copy of the form, and then the form has to be done electronically. And by the way, we need two systems because the British and French computer systems haven't yet been integrated fully, and so on and so on. Trade agreements ideally should be deep in that they should cover not just tariffs, not just explicit trade barriers, but issues about regulation and so-called behind-the-border issues. And indeed, this was the dream that inspired the founders and the early enthusiasts for the single market. The founder, one could say maybe Jacques Delors. Many others had pushed it. Early enthusiasts, including Margaret Thatcher. Others, British politicians who saw this as a way of expanding the reach within economics, the economic reach of the European Union, integrating the continent economically, and doing so in a way that would improve living standards and make manufacturing, and not just manufacturing but services too, much more efficient. And that's what we observe today. And another criterion for an ideal trade agreement perhaps is that it should be comprehensive, in principle covering agriculture and services as well as industry. Services, hugely important for the UK economy. The UK has specialised in services, you might say, has a comparative advantage in it, but it's more a question, I think, of intra-industry trade, that British firms, British expertise, the combination of high-quality regulators but relatively soft-touch regulation has made Britain an ideal location for many service industries to locate. We think of banking, but also legal services, architectural services, media services within Europe, and so on. Britain has specialised in these, and a trade agreement, it would be nice if a trade agreement were to cover those as well. Well, you can see where this is leading, can't you? I mean, when you add up all this and you think about the options, I gave two extreme options on the previous slide. There's a range in between. Now, I guess we all know about the Norway option and the Canada option and the Singapore option and so on. And of all of those, which is likely to be the best for Britain? The analysis, thinking back through the summary of modern trade, the economic theory of trade, the modern theory of international trade, pushes in one direction. The quantitative work done by others in the same tradition points in exactly the same direction and suggests there's only one conclusion, I'm afraid. From an economic point of view, the ideal trade agreement for the UK is a single market. Sorry, guys and gals, but that's what the science says, which doesn't mean that it has to happen. Doesn't mean that it certainly doesn't mean that it will happen, and doesn't mean the losses have to be enormous. Again, if you look at it, it's soft versus hard. There are many varieties of Brexit. Brexit can mean many things, but the single market is the benchmark, and there is no rigorous, up-to-date, professionally respected economic model I know of which shows economic gains from any form of Brexit, any form of leaving the single market. I've come to the end. I want to briefly summarise, noting Ricardo's legacy. I would argue his legacy is our thinking of economics as a science, in the good and bad sense perhaps, and contributing remarkably definitive answers, not conclusive and certainly not the final answers, but definitive answers to two of the three big ideas in international trade theory, with the volume of trade, gravity, being something that we've really only come to understand more recently. I've argued for what the role of theory should be. I want to stress that you can see perhaps the theme running through what I've said, especially when we come to talking about actual applied questions such as Brexit. We don't want to take exact predictions too seriously. We don't want to believe with blind faith the numbers that come out of any particular economic model. We want to be careful when we make forecasts. As the American baseball commentator Yogi Berra famously said, never make predictions, especially about the future. We need to make conditional predictions. Just like if you go to your doctor and say, will I be alive on the 23rd of December next year? Who laughs first? It's a silly question. And yet economists are asked all the time, what's the interest rate going to be a year from now? You go to your doctor and say, should I give up smoking? And the doctor will say yes, because the evidence suggests, on average, smokers die younger. So on average, countries that leave secure and that leave trade agreements that are deep, comprehensive, and have the other advantages I mentioned of the single market do less well. We can predict that, and that's what historical evidence as well as the science suggests in the current state of our knowledge. So don't think of theory as providing a crystal ball for the future. Rather, think of it as providing a lens that allows us to view the world and, among other things, to flush out bad ideas. And I thought I'd end with that concept. Bad ideas, it's a very Donald Trump kind of phrase, isn't it? Bad ideas. Well, yes, there are bad ideas out there. Brexit isn't one, at least in an economic sense. Brexit's not a bad idea in economic terms. It's not great, but if you want it, that's fine. Just don't argue that it's good for Britain economically, but it's a toss-up whether you think it's compensated for in other ways. And one can see other arguments, labour migration especially, where it raises questions that people in Britain have real concerns about, and that's fine. So Brexit is a much bigger question than economics. But there are bad ideas in the economic sense, and I've tried to highlight three of them. I mentioned mercantilism without going into much detail. That's a very bad idea. Sorry, Donald. I mentioned anti-gravity, a view widely held and superficially plausible. and one can think of evidence about it. It's so much easier to plan your New Zealand holiday or to do whatever you want to do, but it's also easier to do things close by. Gravity still is very important. It's a big driver of trade volumes, and there's no getting away from it. And the third I've mentioned is global Britain, in the very precise sense that I used it. I don't want to imply I'm criticising grander visions of the role of Britain in the world, but I'm thinking rather specifically of the argument that it's a good thing to leave the single market and be free to have trade agreements with New Zealand, or the Philippines, or the US, or whatever. And the science suggests, sorry, that's not a good thing economically. There may be political arguments for it, there may be emotional arguments for it, and that's fine, but don't pretend it will be an economic gain. I end with, it's the science stupid. This is a picture of a dog, a nice cuddly dog, and you'll see this is taken from the March for Science in the US, held in protest against cuts and the rationale, arguing against the rationale. You see the dog is holding a poster saying, "I'm a cat," right? With a footnote, citation needed. He's not a cat, he's a dog, okay? And I'm afraid science says some things that are ambiguous and some things that are pretty clear, and that's what I've tried to stress during this talk, while leaving open the many issues on which science cannot comment and on which we have to fall back on our citizenship to be experts upon. Full disclosure, EU funding, no KGB funding, honest. Thank you very much.